You see the sergeant's nod. You hear the shell's first solitary scream tearing the silent, frozen fog of the Ardennes apart. Then, the world erupts. This is the story of the tripwire attack that began Hitler's final gamble, and the young men who woke to a storm they never saw coming. But for Private Arthur Schultz, the story still begins with the smell of coffee and thoughts of Pennsylvania, 8 miles away. The sergeant's watch read 5:30 a.m. He lowered his binoculars. The Ardennes forest was a wall of fog and silence. He nodded to the gunner. The first shells screamed through the frozen air. 8 miles west. Private First Class Arthur Schultz was 19 years old. He was brewing coffee over a sterno can in a shallow foxhole. His breath hung in clouds. He was thinking about Pennsylvania and a girl named Mary, and the fact that his feet had been numb for 3 days. The sound reached him first, a distant metallic shriek, tearing the fog apart. It was the sound of a single gunshot in the distance. Then the world erupting. He never finished his coffee. The shell landed 50 yards away. The explosion was a physical punch of sound and dirt. Schultz was thrown against the frozen earth. His ears rang with a high, white noise. All along the line, other men were waking the same way, not to reveille, but to detonations. The sergeant's single gun was the first domino. The order went down the German lines by field telephone, by runner, by flare. What Schultz and his company did not know was that they were not the target. They were the tripwire. The real force was already moving behind that curtain of sound. In the fog under the thunder, hundreds of German panzers and tens of thousands of infantry in white winter camouflage were crossing the Aar River. Their objective was not a hill or a town. It was the port of Antwerp 100 miles behind them. Hitler had stripped his entire eastern front to assemble this army. It was his last strategic reserve. Every tank, every shell, every 17-year-old soldier with a rifle, it was all here. If this failed, Germany had nothing left. At 5:35 a.m., the German artillery plan began in earnest. They called it Feuerwalz, a rolling fire. It did not advance, it sat and hammered. 1,600 guns, from heavy railway cannons to mortars, fired along an 80-mile front. The ground shook for 20 miles behind the American lines. Trees splintered into matchsticks. Frozen earth turned to liquid mud. Command posts vanished in the first minute. Telephone wires were severed. The world dissolved into vibration, smoke, and blind confusion. In his foxhole, Schultz fumbled for his rifle. The coffee can was gone, a dent in the mud where it had been. He could not hear his sergeant shouting. He could only see the man's mouth moving, his face pale in the flashes of light that now came continuously, turning the fog a hellish orange. The private looked down the line. He saw no one. Then he saw shapes moving in the tree line, not in olive drab, in white. The silence was over. It had lasted for years of planning, for months of secret train movements, for the final seconds as the sergeant checked his watch. It ended in the time it took a shell to fly 8 miles. By 5:45 a.m., 200,000 German soldiers were in motion, and 77,000 Americans, from generals to privates brewing coffee, were trapped in a snowstorm of steel. At 7 a.m., the 28th Infantry Division headquarters in the town of Wiltz was a world away from the fog-shrouded foxholes. It was a place of maps, not mud, of telephones, not thunder. In a warm room smelling of coffee and cigarette smoke, a staff officer leaned over a large situation map. The board was studded with red pins marking American positions. For weeks, those pins had sat in quiet sectors, places labeled Ghost Front. The officer's job was to watch for movement. That morning, he saw nothing but silence made physical. The first call came in at 7:17 a.m. It was a forward observer from the 106th Infantry Division. His voice strained through a crackling field telephone line. He reported probing attacks, infiltrators in the mist. "They're speaking German," he said. "Everywhere." The staff officer in Wiltz added a small blue pin, enemy contact, to the map. It was an isolated mark, a nuisance. Then the switchboard lit up. Another call. From Losheim, then from Hofen, then from a dozen other villages whose names were unpronounceable to the Americans defending them. Each voice was tighter, higher, more frantic than the last. Reports were fragmented, chaotic. Tanks in the fog, white uniforms. There behind us, the blue pins began to multiply on the map in Wiltz. One, then three, then a scattering. The officer stared, his coffee cooling. The pattern was not one of probing attacks. It was a flood. The blue pins weren't appearing in a line. They were blooming like stains behind the red American positions. That is the moment you realize the map in your hands is already wrong. The lines are fiction. The pins are memorials to a situation that no longer exists. By 8:30 a.m., the telephones in Wiltz began to die. Lines were cut by artillery or by German patrols moving with deliberate speed through the American rear. The reports that did get through were apocalyptic in their simplicity. A battalion commander reported his entire front had dissolved. An artillery spotter, his position overrun, whispered coordinates before the line went dead with a sound like a rifle butt hitting the receiver. In Wiltz, they moved pins based on guesswork and dread. The red pins, American units, were now surrounded by clusters of blue. The map was becoming a portrait of encirclement. The German plan, refined to a razor's edge, was working with terrifying precision. This was not a broad front assault. It was a spearhead. Colonel Joachim Piper's 1st SS Panzer Regiment, a mailed fist of King Tiger tanks and veteran SS Grenadiers, was already knifing through the weakest points in the American line. They bypassed strong points, they ignored flanks. Their orders were to drive west to reach the Meuse River, to create panic so profound it would unravel the Allied front. They moved along icy forest trails Americans had deemed impassable for armor. They wore captured American uniforms and drove captured American jeeps to sow confusion. At a crossroads, they would overrun a startled military police unit, then keep moving, leaving the chaos for the following infantry to mop up. By 10 a.m., the scale of the disaster was becoming horrifically clear at higher headquarters. At the command post of the U.S. First Army in Spa, Belgium, staff officers rushed between rooms with new dispatches. The initial assessment, a local counterattack, was shredded. This was an offensive across an 80-mile front. The intelligence failure was total. They had dismissed the Ardennes as a quiet sector, a place to rest weary divisions. They had intercepted German radio traffic about the Watch on the Rhine, but believed it was defensive propaganda. They had aerial photos showing tank concentrations east of the Our River, but explained them away as decoys. Every assumption had been wrong. The consequences of those wrong assumptions were measured in shattered divisions. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh and untested, was holding a wide, exposed salient around the Schnee-Eifel high ground. By noon, two of its regiments, the 422nd and 423rd, were completely cut off, surrounded in the frozen woods. The 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket unit already chewed up in the Hurtgen forest, was being hit across its entire front. Its companies, spread thin, were fighting isolated, desperate battles in villages like Clairvaux and Hosingen, buying minutes with their lives. The 99th Infantry Division, another green unit, was bent back, its lines penetrated in a dozen places. The forward command post in Wiltz was now within the sound of German guns. The staff officer who had first placed the blue pin was now helping to burn documents in a trash can. The maps, once tools of control, were rolled up. The maps, once tools of control, were rolled up and fed to the flames. The smoke from the burning paper joined the thicker, darker smoke now rising from the east. The roads out of Wiltz were becoming rivers of refugees and retreating soldiers, all flowing west, away from the sound of the guns that grew louder with every hour. The German spearheads were not just advancing, they were dissolving the very concept of a front line. In the chaos, two types of movement defined the battle: the relentless, focused thrust of German armor along narrow corridors, and the confused, stumbling retreat of American units who had been told they were in a rest area. One of those corridors was a secondary road winding west from Losheim, a narrow ribbon of asphalt slick with morning frost and hemmed in by dark, silent pines. Down this road, in the pre-dawn gloom of December 17th, rolled a column of the U.S. 14th Cavalry Group, not tanks, but trucks. They were reconnaissance troops, lightly armed. Their mission suddenly scrambled from probing to fleeing. They were trying to fall back to a defensible position near the vital crossroads town of St. Vith. Their commander had ordered a night withdrawal, but fog and confusion had slowed them to a crawl. Now at dawn they were still on the road, their headlights cutting weak yellow cones through a dense, freezing mist. The men inside were exhausted, cold, and operating on the fragmented, terrifying reports crackling over their radios. They knew the Germans were coming. They did not know how close. At the head of the column, a driver squinted into the fog. The world was reduced to 20 yards of visible asphalt and the dark wall of trees on either side. His knuckles were white on the wheel, then a shape solidified in the mist ahead, right at the limit of his headlights. It was blocky, low-slung, and utterly alien on that quiet Belgian road. It was a Panther tank, its long 75mm gun pointing down the road like an accusing finger. The German tank, part of the vanguard of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had outflanked the cavalrymen in the night. It had simply stopped, a silent 50-ton roadblock. The American driver slammed his brakes. The truck skidded slightly on the ice, its tires squealing in the sudden, awful silence. Behind him, the rest of the column concertinaed to a halt, a traffic jam of soft-skinned vehicles trapped between the forest walls. For 3 or 4 heartbeats, nothing happened. The Panther just sat there, engine idling with a low rumble, its commander perhaps as surprised as the Americans. Then a hatch clanged open. A German tanker, his face pale in the gray light, peered out. He took in the line of trucks, their headlights still blazing stupidly in the fog. He ducked back inside. The machine gun fired first. It was a sound like ripping canvas, loud and final. The Panther's coaxial MG-42 stitched a line across the lead truck's windshield, the glass exploding inward. The driver was gone in that instant. The violence was not a prolonged engagement. It was a surgical cut. More German vehicles emerged from the mist behind the Panther, another tank, then half-tracks filled with Panzer Grenadiers. Their fire opened up down the length of the stalled column, a storm of automatic weapons and high-explosive shells hitting targets that could not move, could not hide, and could not fight back on equal terms. Trucks erupted into flame, one after another, their fuel tanks igniting with soft whoops that lit the fog from within. Men scrambled for the ditches, but the ditches were shallow, and the fire came from both sides of the road. It was not a battle, it was an ambush, a slaughter on asphalt. Within minutes, the road was permanently blocked. Burning trucks, their frames twisted and blackening, formed a pyre that glowed through the fog. Ammunition cooked off inside them, adding sporadic cracks and pops to the carnage. The few survivors who made it into the woods fled west, disorganized and weaponless, carrying only the story. The German column, having cleared the obstruction with brutal efficiency, simply rolled forward, pushing the wreckage aside with the brute force of their tanks. They did not pause to finish off the wounded. They had a timetable. They were already behind it. The massacre on the road to St. Vith was not an isolated event. It was a template, repeated at a dozen crossroads that morning. Each time the mechanism was the same. Rapid German penetration, American units caught on the road in transit, a sudden violent collision at point-blank range, and then a German advance that left only wreckage and silence in its wake. These were not deliberate defensive stands, they were traffic accidents with machine guns, a traffic jam that becomes a death trap. The strategic consequence of these ambushes was immediate and catastrophic. The road network, already limited by the dense Ardennes terrain, was now being systematically plugged with burning vehicles and panic. Units trying to reinforce were slowed or stopped entirely. Command and control dependent on those same roads shattered, and with each road severed, the noose around the key American positions tightened. The most important of those positions was a cluster of 5 roads meeting in a modest Belgian market town, barely mentioned on most maps. Bastogne, held by the scattered understrength units of the 28th Infantry Division and soon to be reinforced by the paratroopers of the 1st Airborne. Bastogne was now being cut off from the east, the north, and the south. The German spearheads, like the tentacles of some great beast, were flowing around it, isolating it. The destruction of the 14th Cavalry Column at St. Vith was one of those tentacles, severing a critical artery. By the afternoon of December 17th, the shape of the disaster was no longer just pins on. By the afternoon of December 17th, the shape of the disaster was no longer just pins on a map. It was a pocket, forming in real time. The German tentacles that had severed the roads to the east and north now curled south. On December 18th, the spearhead of the Panzerlehr Division, having smashed through the 28th Division's southern flank, rolled into the town of Noville, just 4 miles north of Bastogne. They were met there by a scratch force of American tank destroyers and paratroopers from the 1st Airborne, who had just arrived by truck after a frantic, freezing night ride. The fight for Noville was a brutal close-range brawl in the fog, but its outcome was secondary. The important fact was this: the road from Bastogne to the north was now under direct German guns. To the south, another German column captured the town of Martelange, blocking the main road from Arlon. By the evening of the 18th, the 4 main highways into Bastogne from Wiltz in the east, St. Vith in the north, Neufchâteau in the west, and Arlon in the south were either cut or being actively contested. The noose wasn't fully drawn yet, but the rope was in German hands. Inside the forming pocket, the temperature plummeted. It was 20 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. The command post for the 101st Airborne was the damp, low-ceilinged cellar of the Heinz barracks in Bastogne. The air smelled of damp stone, cigarette smoke, and cold fear. Maps were spread across makeshift tables, their corners weighted down by empty coffee cups and .45 caliber pistols. The man studying them was not the 100's commanding general. Maxwell Taylor was in Washington. In his place was his deputy, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, an artilleryman by trade, a solid, unflappable officer known more for competence than flamboyance. He had been handed command of a division, a town, and a crisis, all at once. On the map, Bastogne was a small dot. Radiating from it were those 4 highways, drawn in thick black lines. Now, around that dot, his staff officers were drawing in red grease pencil. Each red arc represented a reported German position, a roadblock, a tank column. Slowly, with each new radio report that crackled down the stairs into the cellar, the red lines connected. They formed a wobbly, incomplete circle. McAuliffe watched it take shape. He had under his command a mixed bag: his own 101st Airborne battered remnants of the 28th and 9th Armored Divisions, and some tank destroyer units. In total, about 18,000 men. Facing him were elements of at least 2 German panzer divisions and a Volksgrenadier division, over 45,000 troops. The math was bleak, but it wasn't the numbers that mattered in that moment. It was the roads. A staff officer pointed to the map. "Sir, the Arlon Road is their latest report. Panzerlehr reconnaissance elements here at Assenwas." That was the last major route. McAuliffe didn't need it explained. If the Arlon Road fell, the circle was complete. Bastogne would be an island in a German sea. Every round of ammunition, every can of food, every plasma packet for the wounded would have to come from the sky, if the sky cleared, which the leaden, snow-filled clouds promised it would not. It was the ultimate tactical nightmare. Being trapped in a room with only 1 door is bad enough. This was a room with 4 doors, and someone was at every single one knocking. The reports kept coming. The red circle on the map grew thicker, more defined. Outside, the first flakes of a heavy snow began to fall, silently coating the ruined vehicles already littering the streets. The sound of artillery, which had been a constant rumble to the east, now seemed to come from all directions, a 360-degree horizon of thunder. The pocket was sealed. The 1st Airborne and its attached units were not just defending a town, they were besieged. McAuliffe straightened up from the map table. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The cellar was silent, waiting for the reaction from the man who carried the weight. They expected calculation, a grim assessment, perhaps orders for a breakout. McAuliffe put his glasses back on and looked at the ring of anxious faces, his colonels, his operations officers, men who had jumped into Normandy and fought through Holland. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but of defiance crystallized into a single clear thought. He turned to his staff, his voice calm, matter of fact. "They've got us surrounded." He paused, letting the statement hang in the cold cellar air. Then he finished it. "Good. Now we can shoot in every direction." The tension in the room didn't break, it transformed. The impossible situation suddenly had a frame. They were no longer trapped, they were a fortress. A fortress, as one officer would later note, that the enemy had kindly outlined for them in red. Orders began to fly. The perimeter would be tightened. The outlying towns like Nouville would be tough delaying positions, but the main line of resistance would be the high ground around Bastogne itself. Every road junction, every piece of defensible terrain would be a kill zone. They would dig in the frozen, rock-hard Belgian earth. They would wait, and they would shoot in every direction. But a fortress needs supplies. And as General McAuliffe looked at the snow now falling past the cellar's high, narrow windows, he knew the coming fight would have two enemies: the German army outside the wire and the cold, hungry void within it. The sky was their only lifeline, and the sky for the moment was completely, utterly closed. Midnight, December 21st. The temperature hit 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside Bastogne, in a foxhole that was little more than a scrape in the iron-hard earth, a medic named Carl Anderson faced a problem no training manual covered. He had 1 packet of plasma left for a sergeant with a shrapnel wound in his thigh. Plasma freezes at 32 degrees. The sergeant was shivering violently, his skin the color of old wax. Anderson did the only thing he could think of. He unbuttoned his field jacket, tucked the plastic plasma pouch against his own stomach, and lay on his side in the frozen mud, curling his body around it. Think about that for a second. Trying to keep something warm with your own hands in freezing weather. Now imagine your only heat source is your own core temperature, leaking away into the Belgian winter. Anderson held the pouch for 20 minutes, feeling the cold bite through his wool shirt, waiting for the life-saving fluid to thaw just enough to flow. The sergeant, a quiet man from Ohio, didn't scream when Anderson finally cleaned the wound with icy alcohol. He was past that. His teeth chattered a staccato rhythm against the silence between incoming mortar rounds. "Just patch it up, Doc," he whispered, his breath a ghost in the air. "I'll walk out of here." He wouldn't. Anderson knew it. The wound was a ragged mess, and the cold was doing its own kind of surgery, slowing the blood loss but also slowing the heart, numbing the will to fight. This was the war within the siege. The German shelling was intermittent now. They were conserving ammunition, tightening the ring, but the cold was constant, a 5th column inside the perimeter. It froze machine gun bolts solid. It made the bazooka's firing mechanism a brittle joke. It turned C-ration tins into blocks of inedible ice that had to be thawed over precious tiny fires built from splintered ammunition boxes. Anderson got the plasma into the sergeant. It bought a few hours. He spent those hours moving down the line, from foxhole to frozen ditch, a one-man circuit of misery. He used bandages until they were stiff with blood and frost, then washed them in snow and used them again. Morphine syrets froze. He carried them in his mouth. The logic was simple, brutal. If a man was wounded bad enough to need morphine, he was likely to die anyway. The medicine was for the ones with a chance. the ones shivering with lesser wounds who needed to keep their rifles working. Anderson made those choices in the dark, by touch. He ran out of plasma at 3 a.m. The call came over his field phone, a static, crackled voice from another company line, a lieutenant with a stomach wound. Anderson had nothing left to send but advice. Keep him warm. It was a cruel joke. He returned to his own hole to check on the sergeant. The shivering had stopped. That was the worst sign. Anderson pulled the frozen blanket tighter around the man's shoulders, a useless gesture. He sat with him, listening to the distant crump of artillery, watching his own breath fog in the air. There was no grand last word, no final message for home. The sergeant from Ohio just faded, his breathing growing shallower and further apart until at dawn it stopped altogether. Carl Anderson closed the man's eyes. He took the sergeant's dog tags, noting the name he would later forget, numbed by repetition. The first gray light revealed the foxhole in all its stark detail, the bandages stiff with frost, the empty plasma packet discarded in the snow, the two men, one living, one dead, huddled together for warmth that only one of them had found. Anderson didn't have time to grieve. He had to get the body to the collection point. He had to inventory his depleted aid bag. He had to thaw more syrettes in his mouth. The siege wasn't a battle, it was a slow, cold leak, and every hour the pocket grew a little weaker, a little quieter, as men like the sergeant from Ohio simply went out, like candles in the dark. The fortress General McAuliffe had vowed to defend was holding its perimeter, but inside its walls it was dying by degrees. At 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, the shelling around Bastogne stopped. The sudden quiet was more unnerving than the bombardment. In a captured Belgian farmhouse serving as a forward command post, a young German lieutenant of the 47th Panzer Corps polished his boots to a high shine. He buttoned his cleanest tunic. His task was not to fight, but to deliver a message. He was handed 2 typed copies of a formal surrender demand, a document that was, in every practical sense, an ultimatum. The Americans had 2 hours to reply. The lieutenant fastened a white flag to a stick, with a corporal beside him. He stepped out into the crystalline cold and began walking toward the American lines west of Bastogne. They were spotted immediately from a frozen foxhole. A bewildered American sentry watched 2 figures emerge from the mist, one holding a white cloth that snapped in the bitter wind. He raised his rifle, then hesitated. The rules of war, even here, still held. A shout went down the line. The Germans were brought in blindfolded to the command post in the Heinz barracks cellar. They stood in the damp, low-ceilinged room, the blindfolds removed. The lieutenant clicked his heels, presented the documents, and stated his purpose. The American officers in the room, unshaven, red-eyed from cold and lack of sleep, stared in disbelief. Then a slow, cold anger settled in. They had spent days holding this shattered town by their fingernails, watching men succumb to the cold in their holes, and now the enemy was asking for their surrender. The typed note was passed to General McAuliffe. He read it, his face impassive. The German demand was stark. It spoke of inevitable annihilation, of honorable surrender to avoid a useless slaughter. It was a textbook psychological play, a formal letter that's really an ultimatum. McAuliffe finished reading, looked up at his staff, and laughed once, a short, sharp bark of a sound that held no humor. He dropped the paper on a map table. "Us surrender," he said. "Aw, nuts." The room was silent for a beat. Then a grin spread across the face of his chief of staff, Colonel Kinnard. The reply was perfect, but it couldn't be sent as is. "You can't say that to a German?" someone said. "What should I say?" McAuliffe asked, already turning back to his maps. They decided to send the word he'd said, but properly typed. A staff officer sat down at a field typewriter. The official response, now destined for legend, was a single capitalized sentence. "To the German commander, nuts." The American commander. The German lieutenant, waiting under guard, received the typed reply. He did not understand the slang. "Is this negative or affirmative?" he asked, confused. The American officer delivering it clarified. "It is decidedly negative." The lieutenant saluted, was re-blindfolded, and led back to the lines. He carried the one-word answer through the snow, back to a command that had expected a negotiation, or at least a request for terms. They received neither. The 2-hour clock had run out. The temporary quiet over Bastogne shattered as German artillery, its patience exhausted, opened fire with renewed fury. The pocket had given its answer. Now it would pay the price. The typed reply was handed to a young American captain. His name was Ned Moore. He had been a lawyer in Pennsylvania before the war, a fact that felt like a story about someone else as he took the single sheet of paper in the frozen cellar. His task was to deliver the general's answer back to the German emissary. Moore climbed the steps out of the command post, the cold hitting his face like a wall. It was 2 p.m. The strange, temporary quiet still hung over the shattered town, broken only by the distant moan of the wind through broken timber and the faint, constant sound of men coughing in their holes. He found the German lieutenant waiting under guard in a battered storefront, the windows long gone, replaced by stacked sandbags. The German officer stood rigid, his polished boots now dusted with plaster fallen from the ceiling. Captain Moore presented the paper without ceremony. The lieutenant took it, his eyes scanning the single typed line, his brow furrowed. He read it again, his lips moving slightly as he sounded out the unfamiliar word. He looked up, genuine confusion on his face. "What does this mean?" he asked in careful English. Captain Moore allowed himself a thin smile. It was not a friendly expression, but one of cold, exhausted defiance. He gave the translation his commander had authorized. "It means," he said, the words clear in the still air, "go to hell." The German lieutenant's face went blank. The theatrical formality of his mission, the polished boots, the type to demand, the white flag collapsed against the raw, undignified finality of the American slang. There would be no negotiation, no discussion of honorable terms. The reply was not just negative, it was dismissive. It reduced a formal military ultimatum to a jeer. He stiffened, gave a short, sharp nod, and saluted. The salute was returned. The blindfold was replaced, and he was led back through the American lines, the single sheet of paper folded neatly in his tunic pocket. He crossed back into the German positions, the white flag now feeling absurd. He reported to his major, presenting the reply. The major read it, his face darkening. He then took it to the corps commander. At each level, the confusion was the same, followed by a dawning, angered understanding. The Americans were not just refusing, they were mocking the demand itself. A one-word answer that changes everything. It meant there would be no bloodless victory, no swift collapse of the pocket. It meant every yard of Bastogne would have to be taken by force, by men who would now be fighting against an enemy that had just told their entire army to go to hell. The German artillery batteries, their 2-hour ceasefire having expired, received new orders. The gunners, who had been huddling around small fires, returned to their pieces. At 2:25 p.m., the first ranging shot whistled over the town. Then the full barrage began. The shelling started 20 minutes after the lieutenant returned, a storm of high explosive and steel that fell upon the hospitals, the crossroads, the frozen foxholes. The quiet was obliterated. In his cellar, General McAuliffe listened to the renewed thunder above. The reply had been delivered. Now came the bill. For the men in the foxholes, the 20 minutes of quiet had been a cruel trick, a fleeting memory of a world without the shriek of incoming shells. Now the ground shook continuously. They pulled their frozen coat collars tighter, pressed deeper into the earth, and waited. They waited through the afternoon. They waited through another freezing night, the shelling punctuated by probing infantry attacks that were beaten back in desperate, close-quarters fights in the woods. Dawn on December 23rd brought no relief, only a low, solid ceiling of cloud pressing down on the treetops, a lid of gray steel. The temperature held just above zero, The wounded in the aid stations, their bandages frozen stiff, listened to the artillery and knew the roads were still cut. No ambulances could get in, no supplies could get through. They were on the last of the morphine, the last of the plasma. The arithmetic was simple and it was running out. Then, a new sound, not the deep-throated roar of German artillery or the sharp crack of a mortar. A higher droning hum, faint at first, cutting through the constant wind. Men in their holes tilted their heads, ears straining. It grew, multiplying, becoming a deep throbbing chorus from somewhere above the clouds. To a civilian, it might have been noise. To an infantryman who had been surrounded for a week, it was a specific, known sound, the radial engines of American aircraft, not a lone spotter plane, dozens of them. Above the impenetrable cloud layer, at 18,000 feet, the sky was a shocking, endless blue. Lieutenant John Rabbit Murphy of the 362nd Fighter Group rolled his P-47 Thunderbolt into a shallow bank and looked down. Below his wings stretched a solid floor of white cloud, like a frozen sea. His squadron had taken off from a muddy field in France, their bellies loaded with 500-pound bombs, their mission brief chillingly simple: find a town called Bastogne somewhere under that cloud deck, and help the men who were still there. Navigation was guesswork. Timing was faith. Then, a miracle. A single small hole in the white veil, a sudden window. Murphy tipped his wing and looked straight down. There it was, a perfect white circle in a sea of German-occupied forest. The town itself was a smudge of brown and black, crisscrossed by the thin lines of roads. And on one of those roads, snaking south from the town like a dark vein, he saw it, a column of German armor, panzers and half-tracks, moving slowly, confidently, as if they owned the earth beneath them. They had no idea he was there. Murphy keyed his radio. Target sighted. Column on the road north of the white circle. Going in. He peeled away, his 7 squadron mates following. One by one, the heavy thunderbolts nosed over into the hole in the clouds, the world transforming from blue silence to gray roar in seconds. They plunged through the cloud layer, the white mist whipping past their canopies, and emerged into the grim, twilight world of the battlefield. The column was now shockingly clear, shockingly close. Anti-aircraft guns on flak wagons began to spark, but they were too late. Murphy lined up on the lead tank, his thumb resting on the bomb release. He didn't think about the men inside. He thought about the men in the white circle, listening. The bombs fell away. The thunderbolts pulled up hard, their engines screaming as they climbed back toward the sanctuary of the clouds. Behind them, the road erupted. A chain of fire and black smoke walked down the column, swallowing tanks and trucks. The orderly advance dissolved into chaos. As he climbed, Murphy keyed his radio again, his voice calm over the static. The men in the foxholes below, who had heard the engines, then the bombs, then the distant thunder of exploding fuel and ammunition, heard his words crackle in their command posts and over scattered radio sets. "Merry Christmas, you bastards," he said. "We're here." Then the planes were gone, the sound of their engines fading back into the cloud layer from which they'd come. But they had left something behind. The hole in the clouds they had used did not seal itself, it widened. Slowly, then all at once, the solid gray ceiling began to fracture and break apart. Patches of pale winter blue appeared, then shafts of actual golden sunlight stabbed through, touching the shattered trees, the ruined buildings, the frozen, upturned faces of the men in their holes. For the first time in a week, the men in Bastogne saw blue sky. They felt the weak, precious sun on their skin. They watched as more holes tore open above them, and the droning chorus returned, this time, the wider, deeper sound of C-47 cargo planes. The first parachutes, white and green, began to blossom against the blue, drifting down with canisters of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The sky, which had been a source of only death and steel, was now giving them life. The siege was not over. The shelling would start again, but for that one, crystalline morning, the message was clear. They were not forgotten. The outside world had found them, and it was beginning to fight its way in. The sky had given them hope. The ground would have to give them a way out. The airdrops were a promise, not a deliverance. The ammunition resupplied their rifles, the plasma saved a few more men, but the arithmetic of encirclement remained. 4 roads in, 4 roads out, all cut by German steel. General Patton's Third Army was hammering its way north from the south, but on the map, the distance between the relief force and the white circle of Bastogne was still a solid block of enemy gray. Every mile would be bought in the frozen woods. The key was a village south of Bastogne, Assenois. Take it, and you punched a narrow corridor through to the town. The job fell to the 4th Armored Division at 4:15 p.m. on December 26th, after a brutal day of fighting through one roadblock after another. A task force of Shermans and half-tracks was coiled on the road just south of Assenois. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, gave the order over the radio. His voice was flat, final. Attack Assenois, use a heavy artillery preparation. I want all the artillery you've got right on the village, then go straight through. What followed was not precision, it was obliteration. For 7 minutes, every American gun within range poured high explosive shells into the cluster of stone houses. The ground trembled for miles. When the barrage lifted, the lead tank, a Sherman named Cobra King commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bulge, lurched forward. Its tracks churned the shattered road into mud and snow. Behind it, a handful of other tanks and infantry and half-tracks followed into the smoke. They did not slow for the ruins. They crashed through shattered walls, over abandoned German anti-tank guns, past dazed enemy soldiers stumbling in the rubble. Speed was the only tactic. Bulge stood in the commander's hatch, the freezing air biting his face, his eyes scanning for the next threat. The road north out of the village was a dark tunnel through the pines, and there, silhouetted ahead, was another roadblock, felled trees, debris, and the shape of a German armored vehicle. Gunner, coax, tree line right, Bulge barked, his voice tight inside the tank. The machine gun chattered, suppressing any infantry hiding in the woods. Driver, advance, push through it. The 30-ton Sherman didn't stop. It ground forward, its steel tracks crushing the timber barricade, splintering it beneath its weight. As they cleared the wreckage, Bulge dropped down and pressed his eyes to his periscope, scanning the twilight ahead. Movement. Figures in the trees beyond the next curve. He tensed, his hand going to the intercom switch to order the gunner to traverse. Then he stopped. The uniforms were wrong. Not the dull gray-green of the Wehrmacht, but the darker olive drab of American paratroopers. Foxholes dotted the edge of the woods. A man was standing in the middle of the road, waving. Cobra King rumbled to a halt just feet from him. The hatch clanged open. Bulge emerged into the biting cold. The paratrooper, a lieutenant from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, walked up to the tank. He didn't smile, he didn't cheer, he simply reached out and tapped the Sherman's cold steel hull twice with his knuckle, a solid metallic knock, like a hand on a car window from the outside. He looked up at Bulge, his face grimy and exhausted. "Glad you're here," he said. That was it. No ceremony, no dramatic speech, just 4 words that meant the siege was broken. The corridor was open. It was 6 inches wide, the width of a single tank track on a ruined road, and it was held by bayonets and sheer will. But it was a road home behind Cobra King. The rest of the column began to flow north, carrying surgeons, fuel, and the first real proof that the 101st Airborne had not been written off. The Bastogne pocket was no longer a death trap. It was a besieged fortress with a door, however thin, that would now be held open with everything the Third Army had. The bill for McAuliffe's reply was finally coming due, and Patton was starting to pay it in full. The corridor was open, but the cost was still being counted. Not in miles gained or towns liberated, but in the cargo of the trucks now rumbling north into Bastogne. They carried ammunition, fuel, and rations, but the trucks heading south, back down that fragile lifeline, carried a different kind of freight. They were full of men who were no longer soldiers. The arithmetic of the siege had ended. The arithmetic of the butcher's bill was just beginning. South of Bastogne, in a requisitioned convent in the town of Neufchâteau, a field hospital had been operating at a screaming pitch for 3 weeks. By early January 1945, it was less a hospital and more a processing plant for human ruin. The chief surgeon was a 40-year-old Bostonian named Major Henry Beecher. Before the war, he had been a researcher at Massachusetts General, studying the delicate mechanisms of pain. Now he presided over a warehouse of it. The air in the long hall reeked of antiseptic and a sweet, cloying smell that clung to wool uniforms and wouldn't wash out. Beecher moved from table to table, a clipboard in his hand. His journal was not for medical notes, but for tallies. On January 7th, he made an entry. The numbers were precise, clinical, damning. Amputations major, 17. Amputations, digits, 43. Cause, frostbite, compounded by traumatic injury. He didn't write the names. He wrote the procedures, a list that gets longer every hour. The cold had been a silent collaborator with the German shell fire. Men who had stood in waterlogged foxholes for days found their feet had turned white, then gray, then black. The tissue died from the outside in. The first sign was numbness, a blessing, then a curse. A man might walk on a foot that was already dead, shattering the frozen flesh without feeling it. By the time he reached the aid station, the only medicine was steel, a surgeon's saw, a quick, brutal subtraction to save the sum of the man. Beecher watched a young medic, a boy who couldn't be older than 20, holding a plasma bottle aloft for a patient on the table. The medic's hands were shaking, not from the weight, but from the cumulative weight of everything he'd seen. He had probably been that private brewing coffee over a sterno can 3 weeks ago. Now he was here, in this cathedral of suffering, trying to hold death at bay 1 drop of plasma at a time. Beecher looked back at his journal. Plasma supplies, adequate. Morphine, critical. Another kind of arithmetic. He walked to the post-op ward, a cavernous room lined with cots. The silence here was worse than the noise of the operating hall. It was a dense, drugged silence, broken by low moans or the sudden, sharp cry of a man dreaming he was still in his foxhole. Beecher stopped beside a cot. The soldier was maybe 19, his face pale under a sheen of sweat. The blanket was tented over the space where his right leg ended below the knee. Beecher had performed that amputation himself 2 days prior. The boy's eyes were open, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling. "How's the pain, son?" Beecher asked, his voice low. The soldier didn't look at him. "It hurts, sir." "Where?" "In my foot." Beecher didn't correct him. He knew about phantom limb pain, the brain's stubborn map of a body that no longer existed. The boy's foot was gone, disposed of in an incinerator behind the convent, but his nervous system was still screaming signals from a frozen, dark trench outside Bastogne. The war had taken the limb, but it couldn't take the memory of the wound. Beecher made a note on the chart: complains of pain in absent extremity. Increase morphine. He was saving lives by removing limbs. This was arithmetic, not medicine. He returned to his small office, a former nun's cell. He opened his journal to a fresh page. The entries were becoming shorter, bleaker. January 8th. The flow continues. We are winning the war and losing these men by the piece. A foot for a foxhole, a hand for a hill. The exchange rate is bankrupt. He put his pen down and listened. Outside, the rumble of engines was constant. The convoy from Bastogne was arriving. More trucks, more men on stretchers. More decisions waiting on gurneys in the freezing mud. He thought of the German surrender demand, of McAuliffe's one-word reply that had become a legend. He thought of the paratrooper tapping the side of Cobra King. "Glad you're here." That moment of relief had a price, and it was being paid here in this room in fragments.